And also I'm going to turn on our closed captioning for folks. Okay, I think we should see, we see in the close, there we go. I can see the closed captioning, so it looks like we're all ready to go. So I will begin with a brief introduction, and then I will be passing it off quickly to Make Us Visible New Jersey. I do want to make sure that they have the full time for this amazing conversation we're going to have this evening. And I want to thank them for asking me to be a part of this work with them. So good evening and welcome to everyone. It is my pleasure to kick off tonight's celebration and conversation with you in honor of Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month. My name is Rosetta Treese, and I am the Assistant Superintendent of Curriculum and Instruction here in Hopewell Valley Regional School District. I was a director before I became Assistant Superintendent. I am so proud to continue our equity efforts here in Hopewell. And I was so pleased that Make Us Visible New Jersey reached out to me and asked me if I would be willing to partner with them to do this work. They will be speaking to you this evening about the important work that they are doing to make sure that AAPI history is being taught. I should say this, our collective history as Americans is being taught in our schools in this country. I would like to thank our Superintendent of Schools, Dr. Thomas Smith, and our school board members who have championed and supported our equity work in this school community since I've been here. In the 7 years I've been here, this has been work we've been doing as a school district. Before it was a thing, before it was a fad, we were doing what was best for our kids and our families. I also want to thank my supervisors who have been all in this work and have been finding resources and have also partnered with Make Us Visible New Jersey to ensure that we are making our curriculum culturally responsive for all of our students. I would like to thank our teachers again who are here today, who also will be helping them to gather resources and lessons, and our students. I want to thank our students for being the social justice warriors they are and for challenging us every day to make sure that our schools are a better place for everyone. And then finally, I just have to say how excited I am to see people from all over the state of New Jersey, the tri-state area, from Connecticut. We have activists and scholars here from all over who just want to make sure that we're partnering to do the best work we can and to ensure that we make our country live up to the ideals that were promised to all of us. So with no further ado, I would like to pass the mic off to Make Us Visible New Jersey so they can kick off the events for this evening.
Thank you, Dr. Treese, for that introduction. My name again is Jasmine Ung McHale, and on behalf of Make Us Visible New Jersey, I'd like to welcome all of you to this community discussion. Make Us Visible New Jersey is a coalition of students, parents, educators, and community members working for the inclusion of Asian and Pacific Islander American studies in K-12 education. I want to thank you, Dr. Treese, and the Hopewell Valley School District for hosting this event. And Dr. Treese, I also want to thank you specifically as well for your amazing leadership in our school district, county, and state, enriching and improving the curricula here in this school district year by year. I'd also like to thank all of you for joining us for this event. And wow, we are so blessed to have such a wonderful group of speakers joining us here tonight. Talk about leadership in our communities. Thank you to all of our speakers for taking the time to be here to share your knowledge, experience, and wisdom with us. And boy, do we need it. What a troubling time we have been living through. As a clinical psychologist and a parent of 2 children, I have witnessed children, parents, and educators working so hard to process and respond to the rise in anti-Asian racism that has been growing over the years since 9/11 and escalating even more over the last several years. I've witnessed the pain that children feel when hearing racist remarks. I've witnessed the fear and worry parents carry for the safety of their children and their families, their uncertainty about the future, their anger and mobilization for change. In my own personal struggle to understand these events around me, I've become so hungry for learning about Asian American history and stories, Asian American history, literature, and legacies in the US. Quite shockingly, I reflected on how it hasn't been until I've been in my 40s that I really started this learning. This, despite having 23 years of education, including graduate school and a PhD. This learning has been so central to my own capacity to understand the ebbs and flows of our foreign policies and this combination of nationalism, nativism, and racism, a patriotic racism that is so dangerous in the ways it racializes and surveils Asians in America as yellow peril, as perpetual foreigners, as model minorities, as a virus. I don't want my children to be in middle age before they happen to begin that learning. Tonight's discussion is one of what I hope will be many more such discussions about making K-12 education more reflective of the whole of American experiences, including the stories and contributions of Asians in America and Pacific Islanders in America, and their place in community within the American story. An education that can adequately prepare our children for engaging responsibly in civics, for developing right relations within our communities, and for leading and living compassionately in our increasingly complex, interdependent world. AAPI stories can't be adequately covered inside a single month, but alongside of the efforts of Dr. Treese and the faculty in our schools have made, tonight's discussion will be a good start to making our shared American experiences visible. To start, our first speaker, Attorney General Grewal, regrets that he was unable to be here live with us tonight, but has generously pre-recorded his statement. And it is with great honor that I introduce the Attorney General of New Jersey. Gurbir S. Grewal was named to serve as New Jersey's 61st Attorney General by Governor Murphy on December 12, 2017. Since assuming office, Attorney General Grewal has focused his attention on protecting the interests of New Jersey residents by expanding affirmative litigation, strengthening police-community relations, reducing violent crimes, and fighting the opioid epidemic. Before becoming New Jersey Attorney General, Grewal served as Bergen County Prosecutor, the chief law enforcement officer of the most populous county in New Jersey. Please join me in listening to the Attorney General's pre-recorded statement. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you to Dr. Jasmine Ueng McHale for that kind introduction. I'm grateful for the opportunity to join you virtually tonight to discuss the importance of educating kids in New Jersey about Asian American and Pacific Islander stories and history. I have no doubt that the tragic and alarming rise in anti-AAPI hate is weighing on all of us tonight. And although this increase has recently been the focus of local and national media, it's part of a disturbing broader trend of a rising tide of hate and bias against other groups as well, both in New Jersey and across the country. It's no exaggeration to say that the rise in bias incidents that we've been seeing in New Jersey is one of the most troubling issues that we are confronting as a state. Data on bias incidents reported to law enforcement show that, unfortunately, the number of incidents in our state has increased year after year, from 569 in 2018 to 994 in 2019, to an unprecedented 1,441 reported in 2020. Simply put, these numbers are unacceptable. And equally unacceptable is the alarmingly high number of bias incidents that occur in our schools, perpetrated by our young people. For instance, in 2019, almost 25% of all reported bias incidents occurred in K through 12 schools, more than in any other type of location. And given that bias incidents often go unreported, these numbers likely represent only a small fraction of the incidents involving New Jersey's young people. It's because of this alarming trend that in 2019, Governor Phil Murphy created the Youth Bias Task Force, which took stock of this issue and issued a groundbreaking report containing 27 recommendations for change. Among other things, these recommendations included requiring comprehensive anti-bias education in public schools and developing curricular support materials. And it required anti-bias training for educators and other school employees on implicit bias as well. And we're grateful for the support of the legislature and Governor Murphy in enacting legislation back in March, implementing the first of these recommendations, requiring every school district to incorporate instruction on diversity and inclusion, including examining the impact of unconscious bias on our communities. This is so important because we know that children are not born hating others. Instead, they learn to hate. Children recognize and unconsciously internalize bias at a very young age, at home, in their communities, and in school. In school, students take note of whose stories and histories are taught and valued in the curriculum, and whose are not. That's why it's so critical that we educate all kids about AAPI stories and history, alongside the stories and history of other communities that have all too often been overlooked, marginalized, or even worse, been subjected to mistreatment and injustice during the course of our collective history as a nation. And when it comes to the AAPI community, this means telling the entire story, one which starts over 430 years ago, with the arrival of sailors from what is now the Philippines to Morro Bay, California in 1587. And it also includes shameful chapters about how AAPIs were subjected to exclusionary laws in the late 1800s. And it includes the story of the internment of over 120,000 Japanese Americans during World War II. It's also a history that must include the murder of Vincent Chin in Detroit in 1982, and the killing of Balbir Singh Sodhi, and the targeting of South Asians and Sikhs following 9/11. And it must include, sadly, the rise in AAPI hate that we are now experiencing. It must be expansive as well, because there's tremendous diversity within the AAPI community, which includes more than 40 countries and numerous subcultures, languages, and dialects. This would be an impossible task if we tried to paint AAPIs with a single broad brush. But by taking these steps, I'm confident that we can root out discrimination and bias among our young people to stem the tide of hate before it seeps into future generations. I want to thank you for being here today. I want to thank you for inviting me to join you, and I'm confident that starting in our schools, together we can build a more inclusive and a more just New Jersey.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. My name is Jamie Kim, and I'm a junior at East Lyme High School in East Lyme, Connecticut. Ever since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic back in March of 2020, I've been very passionate about the inclusion and equity for Asian Americans. As a news editor in my school newspaper, The Viking Saga, I've been writing many articles and opinion pieces regarding Asian racism and microaggressions, and I've been working with Make Us Visible Connecticut for the implementation of the Asian American History course. The topics that I will be touching up on will be about the curriculum I received in my history class in high school and why it's important for students to learn about this history. The learning I received in my high school social studies curriculum only scratched the surface of Asian American history. For example, we talk about China's exclusion, Japanese internment, and the Korean and Vietnam Wars. Also, when I was a freshman, we briefly talk about Japanese imperialism in Korea and other islands in the Pacific. But I feel that this current social studies curriculum only focuses on the Asian immigration story and does not focus on how the Asian American community and culture was formed in the United States. I feel that the learning I received so far doesn't get a complete picture of history, meaning it was only taught from the American perspective. Although Asians did contribute to American history, we are not successfully recognized for our work. We only teach events relating to Asians for one class period, or even as small as 5 minutes. There are many Asians who are citizens who are American too, only a different race, but we do not receive full representation as much as our counterparts. This year, I took AP United States History and was not exposed to as many different points of view as I expected. I'm taking AP World next year, but the people who I've talked to about this class said that it encourages Eurocentric thinking, even though the term world relates to all continents. And it feels like all historical events revolve only around Europe. In addition to that, Connecticut added a new class to the social studies curriculum, which is the Latinx curriculum. When this new course was brought to my attention, I questioned why Asian history was not part of this change, making it even more visible that Asian Americans are greatly excluded from history curriculums. It is important that Connecticut implemented the Latinx curriculum, but it is also important to include other races that are underrepresented as well. This made me feel that my culture and history was completely ignored. There is so much deep history and culture within Asian countries. Most of it becomes erased or forgotten, which makes it even more important that we push for an Asian American history course. I think that it's important for students to learn about Asian American history because people tend to have misconceptions of our race. They tend to think that all Asians are good at math and we're whiz kids, or that we're all Chinese. There are some students I encountered that think the only country in Asia is China, or don't think that India is part of Asia. Because Asian culture is not greatly taught, students don't really have a widespread knowledge that every Asian country is unique on its own and holds its own history and culture. Not every Asian country is the same and has similar cultures. I've seen that teachers don't talk about controversial issues in classrooms, mainly because they said if they say something, they could potentially lose their jobs. I understand this side to the statement, but I also think teachers don't address race as much because they don't know how to respond to the issue, since we all don't have education on the topic. Also, I understand it's hard to implement a topic into the curriculum when the entire year is already planned out. So there are obviously many sides to the issue of teachers not teaching students about racism and talking about current events that center around racism. The biggest advice I would have for that is we want to be treated the same as everyone. Especially in my math class, I've been treated differently because of the model minority myth, and people just assume I'm good at math, so I don't need help. This causes me to be afraid to ask for help. Asians are not the model minority. Although there are educated Asians and Asian Americans, there are groups like refugees or immigrants from countries with no prior education that left their home country for a better future. Often Asian Americans' mental health is ignored because the model minority makes us as hardworking and obedient, although it's a myth and used against other minorities in the country. Asians have different cultural characteristics, and so we want our teachers to familiarize themselves with the values, traditions, and customs of our various cultures. Maybe even learning a few words of our language and showing such interest, teachers can set the tone for better trust and communication. Next, I would like to introduce Beth Williams, who is an associate professor of history at Princeton University. She is a historian of race and migration in the United States, specializing in Asian American history. Her book, The Chinese Must Go, Violence, Exclusion, and the Making of Alien in America, won the Ray Allen Billington Prize and the LSW Hawley Prize from the Organization of American Historians.
Thank you, Jamie. I think I'm going to pick up where Jamie just left off, which is talking about the lack of coverage of Asian American history in K through 12 education. So every year when I teach at Princeton, I begin my semester teaching Asian American history by asking my students, what do you already know about Asian American history? What have you been taught? And the most frequent answer I get is nothing. Usually when I press them a bit more, I'll get something. They'll tell me that the Chinese built the railroad or that Japanese internment was a tragic mistake. But most of the time they've learned these things thanks to just a few paragraphs in a high school textbook. And I find that this is true in my not random sample with students that come from all over the places, whether they come from Texas or Virginia or California or New Jersey. In general, their K through 12 education is practically devoid of the history and culture of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. And I think that if you think back to your own education, if you were educated in the United States, I bet you will find that this is true. Ask yourself, what did you learn in school on this subject? So what I wanted to do today, very briefly, was to make 3 points. My first point is that there's nothing natural about this omission. You know, Asians and Pacific Islanders are the fastest growing racial group in America today. And their history in this country dates back centuries. For example, the first Chinese immigrants came to America in the 1820s, and their numbers rapidly increased, starting with the 1849 gold rush in California. These Chinese workers blasted tunnels through the Sierra Mountains to pave the way for the Transcontinental Railroad. They drained swamplands to make way for agriculture. They felled trees to construct towns and cities. They were joined by Japanese and Korean and Sikh immigrants who labored in the fields and in the factories of the American West. And as Asian immigrants remade America's landscape and built America's infrastructure, they also reshaped the legal foundations of the nation. They brought landmark cases to the Supreme Court that helped to define core concepts of citizenship and equal protection. And as Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders helped to build America, we also have to remember that America itself built this community through its actions in the world. The Spanish-American War brought Filipinos, Native Hawaiians, Guamanians, Samoans into the nation's fold. The Vietnam War brought waves of Vietnamese, Cambodian, Lao, and Hmong refugees. My second point is that this is a matter of historical accuracy. If we fail to include Asian Americans in our historical memory, we emerge with a distorted understanding of our nation. So if you ignore the history of Chinese exclusion, you can imagine that America once welcomed the huddled masses yearning to breathe free. If you dismiss the Philippines and the Pacific Islands, you can pretend that America was never an empire. If you omit Japanese confinement during World War II, you can forget how quickly wartime fears can undermine our constitutional principles. I think if we want to understand things like the transformation of American politics in the 20th century, we need to remember women like Representative Patsy Mink, the first woman of color to serve in Congress, and activist Grace Lee Boggs, a revolutionary who empowered the youth of Detroit. And so my third and final point is that it is essential to address this lacuna in K through 12 education. In particular, it's essential because of the broader invisibility of AAPI folks in American culture and arts. So our students don't regularly encounter this history outside of their classrooms because Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders are underrepresented in museums, whether it's an art museum or a history museum, in publishing, whether we're talking about novels or nonfiction, in library collections, in the National Register of Historic Places, in newspaper and media coverage, in popular music, television, and film. So what that all means is that for far too many students, they're starting from zero. They've had practically no exposure to Asian American history outside of the classroom. Okay, so I think that's a huge problem for our communities, for New Jersey, for the nation. But I think we can also think about this as an opportunity because it means that New Jersey educators can play an outsized role in shaping how Americans view this historically marginalized community. So I invite you all to join Make Us Visible New Jersey, and with us help to insist that our schools cover this important history.
I'm definitely gonna talk a bit more about how, in my own story, about how there's a bit of a lack in student exposure to these certain histories. But first, to introduce myself, my name is Surya Balaga and I'm a junior at Princeton High School. Over the course of my high school career, I've become heavily invested in restorative justice and racial equity work, and I've organized and moderated multiple community conversations regarding these issues. As an individual who identifies with numerous minority group characteristics, I'm also passionate about the prospect of intersectional equity, and I enjoy being additionally involved in initiatives related to mental health, climate change, and civic engagement in order to actively engage with this vision. I'm co-president of the Greater Princeton Mental Health Coalition, a youth advisor for both non-Northtown Princeton and Center for Supportive Schools, and an appointee of Princeton's Municipal Youth Advisory Committee. Aside from activism, I enjoy spending time with my dog and songwriting. The extent to which we believe in ourselves is a function of the extent to which the system believes in us. If the system begins to indicate to AAPI youth that we can contribute to society in various beautiful ways and demonstrates this through sharing the accomplishments and stories of our AAPI ancestors, then we will more widely see that we deserve to be seen, and we will start to see ourselves reaching our dreams. My grandma, who grew up in India in the 1930s and 1940s, always talks about the British controlling India and about Gandhi. Since she has anecdotal evidence and was young when India gained independence, I don't know much about this part of history in a more technical sense, and I want to learn so much more about it than the couple history lessons I've had on it scattered throughout the years. It's not that I'm not motivated to research it independently so that I can have more knowledge, because the model minority myth makes it so I can't be laid back intellectually. I just shouldn't have to spend my free time researching my history while being guided through years of white history in school. I would have loved to have known before just a few weeks ago that an Asian American is the reason we have birthright citizenship in the United States, and for that piece of information to have been part of a lesson at school. I really want to feel a more personal connection to what I learn in school. Next, I would like to introduce Senator Vin Gopal, who's a lifelong resident of Monmouth County, born at Jersey Shore Medical Center in Neptune and raised in Freehold. During his first term in the state Senate, Senator Gopal has worked tirelessly across party lines to champion the causes of working families in Monmouth County, small business owners, students, and seniors. He has pushed for successful funding for Monmouth County schools, women's healthcare facilities, mental health support, along with many other key areas of funding support. We are very grateful to Senator Gopal for working on legislation to introduce AAPI curriculum to NJ Public Schools.
Of the New Jersey Senate for South Asian. I'm honored to join you for a few moments to talk to you about the importance of making sure we have AAPI education in our K-12 curriculum. As an Asian American, I know how important it is to make sure that we learn about our cultural heritage here, not just our ancestors in Asia, but what they've done here in New Jersey, what they've done here in the United States. We are one of the most fastest growing minority communities anywhere in the country, right here in New Jersey, across our 21 counties. I want to thank the organizers and everyone pushing for AAPI education in our K-12 curriculum. It's important. So many members of our AAPI community play such a role in the history, the politics, the arts, the academic, all of the different regions of New Jersey's culture, society, and history. And it's important that they're in our textbooks. I look forward to continuing to work with you and making it a reality so every child growing up, every Asian American child growing up can look and see the incredible role models and heroes that came before us who played such an important role in New Jersey and America's history. Thanks so much.
Surya, can you introduce Mike, please?
Yes. I would like to introduce Mike Keogh, who is the founder of the hashtag I'm Not a Virus campaign, which began in March of 2020. Their mission is to create more opportunities in Asian American communities for parents, young adults, and students to be engaged through storytelling and intersectionality. Mike is an award-winning wedding photographer, activist in residence at the University of Connecticut's Asian and Asian American Studies Institute, and a member of Make Us Visible Connecticut.
I can't start my video. Okay, there. Thank you. Hi, thank you for that warm introduction, and thank you for inviting me into this space. Last February, with the language that was being used to talk about COVID-19, I had a fear. I couldn't fall asleep at night. I was worried for my children. I was worried for my parents. I knew that the China virus would prevent them from going to the stores, that they would have to fear discrimination and racism. So as a photographer, I decided to start a project by asking a simple question: if not a virus, then what are you? What do you love about yourself? And to showcase that attacking against an Asian American was an attack against one's own community. And that's how the project began. When I'm asked, how do you feel about the hate crimes, the rise in hate crimes? What are your thoughts on it? For me, none of this is new. Our communities have had stories that have been passed on through oral traditions, oral histories. As a Cambodian American, I knew that refugee communities were besieged with racism, including my own family. From Lowell to Utica, New York, to places as far as Minnesota, the racism that many of us experienced at that time led to the death of Hang Lim, a young father who didn't get to watch his child grow up because he was killed in Philadelphia. Vandy Fong was killed in Lowell, Mass. A 13-year-old boy killed by an 11-year-old. That breaks my heart, And when we talk about about New Jersey, there were the Dot Busters in 1987, which should be in history books in New Jersey. The Dot Busters were a gang of teenagers that went around and attacked South Asian Americans for the color of their skin. Young Navroz Modi, an American son, was out for brunch with his friends when he was killed after a string of 14 attacks. None of this is new. We've experienced this violence, and education is the solution. It lets us see ourselves in community with one another. And this is why I'm such a big proponent of comprehensive ethnic studies that includes Asian Americans, Latinx, African American studies, indigenous studies, because we need to see ourselves in community with one another to be in service of one another. When Professor Beth Lou Williams was speaking about these heroes of Asian Americans, I didn't know any of them until I was 22, 21, which meant that when my teacher made a joke when I was in high school about how we didn't have to go to Chinatown because it smells and because they eat pigeons and rats there, I was the only Asian American child in my class. And I remember distinctively how that made me feel, how small I felt at that moment. But I couldn't understand what hurt me, besides that I was singled out in front of my peers. And as I got older, I realized that in the middle of a classroom discussion, she singled out people that looked like me, that she took away my identity. Chinatown was a magical place for me. It allowed me to get dim sum with my grandmother. And my parents would pick up these fruits like lychee, logan, mangosteen, and we would drive them back to Connecticut and I would devour them in the car. All that was stripped away from my cultural heritage, my identity. And I had no language to push back against this. I did not love myself that day, So this is why the push for Asian American studies is just so important. Asian American and Pacific Islander studies. We need to be made visible so our communities can see ourselves in service to one another. And it could provide a student that was like me or like my child the ability to love themselves. His teacher read Bibimbap last year, and my son's in pre-K. And I can tell you that when he saw this rice cooker, in the book, he got so happy. He was excited. And his teacher started having a conversation about, do you cook at home with your parents? And every child could participate on this. The Asian American experience is not just for Asian Americans. When Professor Beth Lou Williams and Seehra were speaking, I wanted to share that we did create a coloring book for educators of Asian American history, Asian American pioneers that include civil rights activists, as well as artists and writers, just to flesh out who we can be and where we can exist. And I support this movement in New Jersey. I think it's amazing. It'll bring people closer together and allow them to communicate based on values instead of fears and scapegoating. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike.
Hi, I'm Christina. As I'm listening to all these wonderful guests, I reflect on how I have been invisible to myself. I am a proud graduate of New Jersey public schools, specifically West Windsor, Plainsboro. And I fit the model minority myth. I worked hard, I loved school, I did well. I got top academic credentials. And now I see how that model minority myth has hurt me and people like me. I realized that the erasure of Asian American and Pacific Islander stories, legacies, and contributions have made me invisible to myself. Sometimes I feel I can't see myself because my story is so marginalized. Likewise, when I look at the beautiful and wonderful AAPI friends and family around me, I also see how they have been rendered invisible. And that's why I have joined Make Us Visible New Jersey to advocate for more AAPI inclusion into the New Jersey public schools. I also wanted to share that I was a former college professor teaching at an American university in Asia. And I was also teaching about political science, history, and economics in Asia. And it was actually in that context that I also began to see how the lack of understanding about Asian histories and Asian politics was literally making it dangerous for me. I'm a Taiwanese American, and as news of China spreads around the world, and as the US-China relationship evolves, the news is literally dangerous to me because I am seen as Chinese. So with that, it is my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Amman, Seehra, the Assistant Director of the New Jersey Department of Human Services, the Northeast Regional Director of the Sikh American Legal Defense and Education Fund, and co-founder and chair of One Project, a faith and community coalition based in Robbinsville to address social needs through education and volunteerism.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me. First, I want to say thank you to everybody who's joining today. I think just taking that initiative to join this webinar and get to hear everybody speak is the first step in making real change. Next, I'd like to say thank you to Make Us Visible New Jersey. I think the work that you're doing is pushing us in the right direction and creating that change that we really all need to have in order to change the narrative and change the discrimination that's being faced by the AAPI community. And also I want to say thank you to the Hopewell School District for hosting this event. I know a couple of years ago, I did a presentation on Sikhism at Bear Tavern Elementary School, and it's great to see you guys taking the lead and pushing this initiative forward. I'm here today to talk to you guys and sharing my personal experience and the things that I had to go through growing up and kind of how I responded to that. I'll start with kind of the most, I just say the most shocking, which is post 9/11. I was a kid that was born and raised in New Jersey. I was in law school at Rutgers Camden at the time of 9/11. And I went from what I thought was a regular, normal kid to all of a sudden not being able to go out in the streets after 9/11. I had people throwing rocks at me, yelling things at me. Every time I went in an elevator, everybody else came out. And it got to a point where one day I went to the Cherry Hill Mall just to study, and someone's child came too close to me and they started screaming and yelling. And it was that moment where I decided that, if I really want to make a difference, I'm gonna have to do something about it. And I started volunteering for SOLDEF and doing a lot of the public education work that I do now, including trainings for law enforcement, federal partners, and so many schools as well. But looking back on it, it wasn't a reaction to 9/11. That discrimination and racism has never been there for long before that. I remember in elementary school having friends saying, hey, my parents said that I'm not allowed to invite you to my birthday party. I remember in high school, someone wrote Amman Seehra equals Saddam Hussein. I remember in high school, I wasn't allowed to play basketball because they said that I might be hiding weapons in my hair. And then even to current times, I've gone to job interviews where people interviewed me for 2 or 3 minutes and they just basically said, you know what, we're not the right culture for where we are. And then just the constantly hearing, go back to where you come from. And the thing is that my experience is not unique. It's something that so many people face, too many people face. We recently did a survey at SOLDEF of Sikh Americans, and 58% of Sikh American respondents said that they had been bullied or discriminated because of their identity. 58%. Just think about that. But the beauty is that in the Sikh faith, we believe in something called Chardi Kala, which is eternal optimism and joy. And I think that defines how you respond to these situations. The AAPI community is not just a community of victims. We're a community of change makers, a community of teachers, a community of engineers, doctors, we're a community of actors, artists, sculptors. We go in all parts of society. And I think it's time for us to start to change that narrative and get out there and be more active. Don't make yourself visible. It requires an effort from all of you. So with that, take that eternal optimism and take that optimistic approach. So we're all here today. We're responding to the increase in hate crimes. We're responding to shootings targeting the AAPI community. We're responding to everyday discrimination faced by New Jerseyans, but we're coming with a solution about changing curriculum so that the AAPI community is no longer invisible, that we learn the true history of the United States and what the AAPI community has done to further our country and the contributions that we've made. So my kind of ending words for all of you is be that difference that you want to make in your community. That means coming to events like this. That means signing on to the open letter that Make Us Visible New Jersey has. That means talking to your school administrators and your boards of education. That means reaching out to your legislators. But if you want to make a change in your community, act, volunteer, and keep on coming to events like this. So thank you all very much.
Thank you, Amman. My name is Kani Elangovan. I'm a mother, psychiatrist, and activist. When I grew up, we were one of 3 Indian families in our nearly all-white neighborhood. Racism impacted my childhood in many ways, and sometimes made me fear for my safety, and sometimes with good reason. I, like Helen Zia, feel racism begins with the idea that some people are less human than others. It's so important to intervene early as possible to teach kids how to see the full humanness of those who are other, to have knowledge of and comfort in their own identity, and to know our full history as a nation. We are grateful to New Jersey State Senator Vin Gopal for drafting legislation for AAPI curriculum. We will need your help to get the bill passed. We are looking for point people in each New Jersey county to help us spread the word about the legislation, to call and write letters urging your state representatives, state senators, assemblymen to pass the bill. If you're willing to help in this effort, please reach out to us. We will be putting a link to the contact form and to our open letter in the chat. Then we can contact you when the time comes for us to advocate for passing legislation. I also wanted to let you know that this summer is a very important time for curriculum change because of the new bill A4454, which requires instruction on diversity and inclusion that was passed on March 1st. Schools will be updating their curriculum this summer. This is a time when we can contact our school districts and advocate for the inclusion of Asian American Pacific Islander studies and the studies of other marginalized communities. We've included a link to the presentation we've been giving to local school districts. It has examples of many AAPI curricula and also collaborations to teach AAPI studies. I would like to introduce Professor Dake Zhang, who joined Rutgers Graduate School of Education after pursuing her doctorate in special education from Purdue University and working as an assistant professor at Clemson University. Coupled with a diverse background in special education, educational psychology, and math education, and with her expertise and research interest in math learning, she has developed and validated accommodation techniques and intervention strategies for students with math learning difficulties. Thank you. You're on mute, Daka.
Thank you for the opportunity to be here today. Thank you very much. And as you may already tell from my strong Chinese accent, different from what all other panelists tonight, I am a first-generation immigrant. And so tonight, I'm going to share about my perspectives from my three identities. First, I'm a first-generation immigrant. Second, I'm a mother of 2 Asian American boys who were born here. And third, I'm an educator. Even though in the past my area is not about AAPI issues, I perceive this is a very important issue for Asian American children and Pacific Islanders, but it's also for the equity and excellence for all students. So yes, I am a first-generation immigrant. And when you read a book or AAPI story or movies, like my parents or great-grandparents moved from China or Korea or India how many years ago, and I am that parent, or maybe later grandparent. I came here when I was in 2005 and in my 20s to pursue my degree in education as an international student. And in the past 16 years, as a first generation, I finished my degrees. I started my family. I got my first job. And now I have 2 Asian American boys. If you ask me to use one word to describe my feelings to this country, I would say I'm thankful. This is true, and I know this is also from the bottom of many first-generation Asian Americans. We came from another country. We did not belong here, but we got the opportunities that we probably could not have in the countries where we were born. So we were grateful for what we have obtained, for what this country have provided us. I am from China, and my hometown is very close to Wuhan. You know, that's where this pandemic started from. Honestly, I have kind of a mixed, complicated feelings. Sometimes I even feel kind of shame or apologetic at sometimes for this pandemic. You know, no one wants your hometown to be well known for a virus or for death. This is definitely not something that I take pride in. As everyone, we hope that our hometown could be well known for something that contributes to the human being rather than virus or death. But yeah, I have been trying to understand the emotions that many people have in this wave. Sometimes I'm thinking maybe they're just too stressful because they lost their family members, they lost their jobs, and everything will be fine after our after this pandemic. However, after these waves, after seeing so many crimes against our Asian Americans, against AAPI people this year, I have started to reflect our thinking or our attitudes. I mean, we were happy, we seemed to be satisfied, and we are quiet, and we are always grateful for what we have received. Is that part of the reason we were considered as good Asians? And this is this part of the reason where our the stereotype comes from? So yes, and tonight I'm here to call for the fight for equal rights, for equal rights for our children, for our AAPI group. Also because of my second and third identity. I'm a mother of 2 Asian American boys, and I'm an educator for all American children. If you have read the famous novel, The Joy Luck Club, you probably know how many first generation mothers are expecting their children to be a true and real American. And in the past, we almost have never doubted about it. However, during this wave of anti-Asian hate, this issue, this assumption or expectation seems to be questionable whether or not our children will be considered as real Americans. When a Korean American girl was yelled with "Go back to communism China" close to the Times Square, when I myself was truly hesitating if I should choose remote learning to avoid possible school bullying for my boys. This is a question: who could be considered as American? There is a study that many K-12 teachers and students cannot tell differences between Asians and Asian Americans even today. Just like during World War II, many Americans were not able to tell the differences between Japanese and Japanese Americans. And that was the reason, that was at least a part of the reason, so many Japanese Americans were sent to the concentration camps. With China is becoming an enemy of the United States, will what happened to Japanese American in World War II happen again to the Chinese Americans here? This is a question we need to think. And how can we stop this? As you know, I have strong accent and my English is not perfect. So my colleagues, when they say you're very good at English, you speak English very well, I would consider it as a compliment. But I know if you say that to my boys, your English is good, where are you from? That's not a compliment, it's insulting. They were born here, they are Americans as the same as all other American kids. So this is a question we need to tell all the kids, tell my kids and his friends, tell everyone that they have a root, not just in Asia, they also have a root in the United States. And this could be told from the Asian American history. As Dr. William Du William just said, there are hundreds of years of history of Asian Americans in this country. From Filipino Americans who arrived as early as the 16th century to the Chinese, Indian, Filipino American soldiers during the Civil War, and the Chinese American railway workers, and the 442 Infantry Regiment during the World War II. Asian Americans and the Pacific Islanders, we have left our footprints on every single page of the US history. And we are not foreigners as a group. Again, we need someone to tell our children that Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders has a cultural root in the United States, and they share ownership of this great country as the same as other children do. I think this can be done by every teacher, not just a history teacher in our K-12 education. It could be as simple as, could you add some Asian American names in the reading list for little kids? Can you add some books in the stories you read to the children? And could you please have more like replace like the story backgrounds when you teach word problems in your math class or science classes? There could be a lot of things that you can do from today or tomorrow. And in addition, as an educator, what I need every educator to do, and we are going to work together, is that we will work together to develop and materials by translating the Asian American history into handy materials for every teacher to use in classrooms. They could be teachers' books, student worksheets, lessons, presentations, videos, manipulatives, everything. We will work on providing school professional development workshops to help teachers get familiar with our AAPI stories, history, and literacy. There are a lot of things that we can do, no matter big or small. We can start from small. We can start from tomorrow. Let's start right now, and always remember, your support is important. So thank you.
Thank you, Professor Dake Zhang. Thank you. Can you guys see me? No?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Okay, great. Yeah. So my name is Ying Lu, and in Chinese language, my name is Lu Ying, and I'm a Princeton public school parent of 2 Chinese Caucasian mixed race children. Professionally, I'm an associate professor at NYU Steinhardt School of Cultural Education and Human Development. My field of expertise is applied statistics and education policy evaluation. But today I'm here as a proud member of Make Us Visible New Jersey. And I wanna just also share a little bit of my personal story. Just like Dake, I grew up in China. I was born in western part of China, and I grew up in Beijing. And I came to the US in my early 20s. Actually, my first stop was Princeton. Then I traveled around. I lived in many different places in the US. And after another 20 years, I finally returned to Princeton. And in this 20-some years of my life in the US, at beginning, just like many immigrants, I had kept my head down, working hard. And I also completely bought all the American culture, the version of American culture, the norms and the ways of dialogues and narratives and the way it was presented to me, not realizing it's only partial. It didn't represent what American really is. And it was until gradually when I finally got my roots in the US And I got a job at NYU, I got tenure, then I have family, I have children. Then I started to feel more comfortable looking around. And I started looking and look at things actually happen around me as compared to the mainstream voice, the voices that told me what it is. Then I started seeing more discrepancies and started asking questions. It was really last year during the Black Lives Matters movement. Its experience really transformed me in many, many ways. Because before I had many questions about even my own identity, just like many panelists had been speaking about how Asian American history, right, and had been erased in the in school, in education, in all spaces, right? So we had very little to know about what Asian American really is. But it was not until last summer when I decided I delve in more into studying race and racism in the US. And now I just started seeing and understanding how deeply and structurally the issue is. And also it's such a profound and massive problem. It goes beyond just, in a way, because when we talk about this, we always take a very US-centered view. But here I also want to remind everybody, when we think about the US center, there's also a version of what is United States, what US really is. Just like Professor Beth Williams mentioned, about history, and you look at history, there's a very profound, a massive lack of historical perspective, not only in our teachings about history or just in our daily conversation and even academic research, and also lack of globalization, global perspective. And one thing I want to remind everybody is that the Asian American population grew rapidly in the 1980s. And since 1980, Asian American population has grown 600%, which makes the biggest, the fastest growing group. That also means a lot of Asian American people in the United States who identify themselves as Asian Americans are first generation immigrant or children or rising young adults of first generation immigrant, which makes it very important for us there's the education, the issue about education in K-12, but there's also a very important issue about educating Asian American immigrants, right? And anyway, I'm just share my story, and I'm very proud to be a member of Make Us Visible New Jersey. And it's my great honor to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Khyati Joshi, Professor of Education at Fairleigh Dickinson University. As a teacher educator, she trains teachers and administrators on anti-bias and anti-racist education. She's also the co-editor of a very well-received book, now at 3rd edition, Teaching for Diversity and Social Justice. She has also published in field of Asian American studies. Her books include Envisioning Religion, Race and Asian Americans in Dixie, Race and Migration in the South, and New Roots in Americans, Sacred Ground, Religion, Race and Ethnicity in Indian America.
Thank you so much for that introduction. And really a huge thank you to Make Us Visible. I have been doing this work in New Jersey since 2003. Social justice education and Asian American studies that's what I live, those intersections. And it is so exciting to have so many of you making this effort and pushing forward for all of this. I do work, I'm a professor in the School of Ed at Fairleigh Dickinson University, and I teach in-service and pre-service teachers, and I work with school districts as well as independent schools. And the first thing I want to talk about is some of the training that is done with educators and administrators. So first and foremost, we hear a lot about diversity and inclusion, and I'm very clear that we have to make it also about equity and justice, because diversity and inclusion, one of the things I start out with is the distinction between the diversity approach and the social justice approach. And those of you who are on social media, particularly Instagram, if you find me, I did actually a learning journey on this. So the diversity approach is good, right? We learn about holidays and cultures and peoples and groups, but the diversity approach considers all groups on equal footing, right? And that's not the case in the United States. The justice approach takes into account issues of oppression and takes into account that there are some groups, if we're talking about race, that have advantage, white folks today, and other groups that are at a disadvantage because of race. And so it's really important to have educators and everyone keep both things in mind. Now, I know that you all have created an amazing Google Doc with ways to incorporate Asian American history into social studies and high school. The thing is, we actually have great books out there. Professor Lou Williams has written books. I've written books. We've got friends and colleagues who've written books that are helpful for, you know, incorporating into the curricula. The thing is, though, is that the teachers need the training. You can't teach what you don't know. Okay, and so this bill, in terms of requiring anti-bias education, is important. However, it's way more in depth. What we need is way more than that, right? So when I'm working with, you know, first of all, my students take a semester-long class, and some of them are then do their thesis with me and things like that. And when I'm working with school districts, you know, it's 4 and 5 and 6 days of training. It's not a 2-hour or a 5-hour, right? Because the trainings have to simultaneously help people understand this information, as well as work on excavating their own bias and privilege. So it's got to go back and forth with that. And that's how I've been doing the work. I've been incorporating Asian American studies into all my teacher trainings. And I will tell you that I do this one game, and I can't wait to get back to in person and do it in person, because I haven't figured out how to do it virtually. But I do this big history game that takes into account race, GLBT, gender, class, and you would think maybe that only the high school teachers would be interested. And my first grade teachers love it, and my 4th grade teachers love it, because it's kind of the game on the history of inequality in the United States. But when you can start seeing the connections, then you can start actually seeing how deeply ingrained this is, you know, the structural piece, as you were talking about before. So, and what I have found in my years of doing this work is that folks want this information. Folks want to know. And I bring Asian American studies. It's just part of what I do. Because the other thing is, when we're doing this, it's really what we might even call comparative ethnic studies, right? The best way to really have this information sink in is not just learn about Asian Pacific Americans, I think you would agree, but putting in context with African Americans and Hispanic Americans and biracial, multiracial America, right? So, you know, one of the examples is, you know, those of us who went to school in the United States, you know, we all learned Dred Scott, and I'm probably one of the oldest here today on this group. I grew up in the 80s in Atlanta, Georgia. And, you know, we all learned about Dred Scott. When I teach about the Thind and Ozawa cases to my teachers, the Thind decision in 23 and the Ozawa decision in 22, I say, okay, well, let's put the theme of citizenship together, right? Because then you can see how different groups were impacted, right? Dred Scott over here, Ozawa and Thind over here. So that's one example, right? And what happens is, if we're focused on race here, which since we're talking about Asian Pacific America, we are, you know, what it starts showing is that students and teachers and administrators start connecting the dots, and you can actually see the development of whiteness. So when we talk about whiteness today, and some people get kind of bent out of shape about it, if we use evidence, if we use history and law to show this, it's really important. The other thing I want to say is that it's one thing to bring Asian American studies into the curricula And then teachers also have to understand, and school districts have to understand the lives of our population, right? That we are affected by racism in a different way than, let's say, the Black community is. And, oh, we need to talk about religious diversity. A lot of my academic work is at the intersections of race and religion, right? We have to talk about religion also. So one of the things is we have to really see how discrimination impacts different groups in different ways. And that's really, really important. So to keep in mind, again, you know, the diversity versus the justice approach is really, really important. And so I just want to, you know, reiterate again how wonderful it is to have, what, 75 people, 80 people on this wanting to move forward. And I will say that, you know, this bill that was passed is just the tip of the iceberg. If sometimes it hasn't happened lately, but you know, I would get a call, oh, Professor Joshi, can you come to a faculty meeting to do X? I'm like, no. You need to understand this is a long-term commitment or I'm not your person, right? And more school districts and schools are understanding that. So thank you for organizing this, and thank you for inviting me to be a part of
it. Thank you, Dr. Joshi. We are nearing the end of our session. Thank you to Dr. Joshi and to all of our guest speakers for sharing their perspectives. Before I hand it off to Dr. Treese, I just wanted to say again that share your story, make yourself visible, and get involved. One way to get involved is to fill out our sign-up form that will be dropped in the chat again. We also are taking a pulse of the community, and I'll send another link into the chat if you want to take a quick and fun survey. And thank you all again. And I just encourage you all to think about sharing your story, making yourself visible. Off to you, Dr. Treese.
Thank you. And thanks to all the presenters tonight that came. I really appreciate you being a part of this conversation. I just wanted to make a few closing remarks. As someone who has loved and worked with writing curricula for years, I really just want to make sure that as we, especially the administrators, and there are a lot of my counterparts from other areas that are in this call tonight, to be cautious of a couple of things. As we started this work to change our curriculum here in Hopewell, and we started grappling with, you know, sort of, and I'll start with language arts because I was an English teacher, we started grappling with the classics, right, and the canon, and whose voices we were stifling or perhaps banning and things like that. We were having real discussions around To Kill a Mockingbird and Huck Finn and some of the other books that we all read as kids in this country, right? I found a tool that I added to the chat from NYU Steiner, which was a culturally responsive scorecard where you could really audit your curriculum and examine whose voices were missing. And I know it's AAPI Heritage Month, but it's also Autism Awareness Month. And also this month, we recognized Sikh Awareness Month. And all these months, last month was Black History Month. Next month, we have LGBTQ and a number of other things, Black History Music Month, right? I would like us to begin to, and I love the celebrations, but begin to really, really examine how do we create that intersectional equity that one of our scholars mentioned today, one of our students actually mentioned today, in our curricula across the board. I really warn against the standalone courses, although I love them. I love that we have an Asian American history course at a local district, but I also know that we had African American history at Hopewell High School years ago, probably was instituted right after the 1968 riots, somewhere in the 70s, where all these courses were created, all these great textbooks were available all of a sudden in reaction to tragedies that were happening in this country. Just like now we're uncovering all this AAPI history because we've had another tragedy in the country. But then we find that things get better as we start to educate ourselves and our children. And then those courses, now we don't need them. We can just pluck them out, right? And replace them with something else, because it's always been a standalone and it hasn't been our collective history. It is not AAPI history or Black history or LGBTQ history or non-binary people's history. This is American history, and we have all built this country and continue as we come here as a country of immigrants. We continue to build this country, right? Our indigenous people whose land and took care of this land that we now occupy. We need to make sure that that curriculum is embedded deeply in all subject areas as much as we can, so that when we all become gray old ladies and men rocking in a chair, non-binary people rocking in a chair, that somebody doesn't decide that this is fixed now. We need to stop doing this and pluck it out. So embed it everywhere you can, work together to make sure that all the voices you can are included. And then finally, we can't have every culture in our textbooks. So maybe we stop buying folks' textbooks that have us left out. Maybe we start curating our own content. And maybe we start looking at how do we create opportunities for our students, because we can't have it all built into the content as we try to meet the math standards and the language arts standards and the social studies standards as they evolve. But can we take time and carve it out of our school day, right? To have conversations and let folks tell their story. Let folks tell their narrative and let them share their rich cultures. And it's going to get more and more complex as we begin to learn about each other and realize we have these parallel and parallel values that really kind of come together like this. We all want the same things for our family and loved ones. And we start to already see that we're blending our cultures. So let folks tell their stories and step outside of that mandated curriculum that we have to cover. Get off the curriculum train, as we say here in Hopewell, and have social emotional learning days where kids just share their heritage and narrative, and we celebrate that. So thank you again for coming. I'm nowhere excited about this work. I'm excited about working with Make Us Visible New Jersey and all of my colleagues that are here today from other districts, across districts, and in our own district. And I know that we're going to do great work and offer great curriculum and professional development to our teachers so that they can do this work and feel confident that they have what they need to do this work well. Have a good night, and I hope to see you all soon in our future conversations.